Good afternoon to everyone out there, wherever you may be, and welcome to this virtual event with historian Heather Cox Richardson about her new book, How the South Won the Civil War: Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. I'm Joanne Freeman. I'm a professor of history and American studies at Yale University, and this afternoon I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Heather about her book and other matters political. This program is being produced by the Brooklyn Historical Society, which has been a cultural hub for civic dialogue and community outreach for over 150 years. That's some real history there. Now on to Heather's book. Her book has gotten a lot of critical praise. For example, the Washington Post writes, Heather Cox Richardson, a professor of history at Boston College, explains Goldwater's crusade and the trajectory of modern conservatism in her masterful book. A timely book, it sheds light on what was perhaps the most important political coalition of the 20th century. And Publishers Weekly says, though Richardson underemphasizes the prevalence of racism, sexism, and inequality in other parts of the country during and following the Civil War, she marshals a wealth of evidence to support the book's provocative title. Conservatives will cry foul, but liberal readers will be persuaded by this lucid Jeremiad. Now, I'm really, really excited to dig in here, but first, I want to invite those of you out there in the world listening to share your questions for Heather. And you can do that by typing into the Q&A box that I think you'll all see at the bottom of your screen. We will take as many as we can in the second part of the program, which as a whole is going to last about an hour. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Heather Cox Richardson, professor of history at Boston College, author of 6 books about American politics, and writer of the very popular newsletter, Letters from an American. Welcome, Heather.
Shift, Control.
Oh, there
Thank you, Joanne. And yes, I was trying to unmute myself. And I want to start by thanking first the Brooklyn Historical Society for doing this, but also to say to people watching that I'm incredibly excited about this, because this is the first time that Joanne and I have been able to do our own history thing together. And I have asked her to open this way up beyond my book, and not only to talk about her new book as well, Fields of Blood, but also to talk about how the past speaks to the current moment and to talk about what's going on in American politics today. So we certainly will talk about my book, and I will talk about her book, but we'll also talk about the present moment. And the fact that we're limited to an hour is just such a grim thought, but thank you for giving it a shot, Joanne.
I'm excited to be here too, so this is going to be fun. Let me start with, in a sense, what's an obvious question, but it's probably one that a lot of people are wondering about right now. So even in just the 2 little bits that I read about responses to your book, they use words like provocative, timely. And so I want to start by asking, how is it that you came to write this book? What brought you to it, given how timely it is?
Well, of course, you never know what's going to be timely when you start writing. But one of the things I study is sort of, I used to call it the zeitgeist. I read politics all the time, and I say, you know, how are people thinking about things? And I'll explain a little bit later where I came to end up on that. But what happened was that when I was writing my last book, The History of the Republican Party, when I read Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, I was gobsmacked because it was so similar to James Henry Hammond's Mudsill speech from 1858, in which he talks about how really government is best if it's run by a few really good people, and you know the government can't get involved in things because that's going to be unconstitutional and gonna destroy certain people's liberty. They use that word a lot, and they were very, very, very similar. And I'd never seen that comparison. And while I was writing that book, I was also I was teaching, and I was teaching the Trail of Tears, the 1830 movement or the pushing out of the Native Americans out of the Southeast into Oklahoma. And so I was steeped that particular week in the congressional conversations about why it was a good thing for the Indians to lose their land and be forced on this deadly march on which so many of them died, and why this happened to be, why the Congress had to do this and why it was a good thing for the Indians. And that happened to be the same week that some football player, and I don't remember which one it is, but some football player was caught on a video dragging his girlfriend out of an elevator by her hair. And I don't remember any of the characters involved, but what hit me about those two things was that the language was the exact same. The same excuse for this man dragging his girlfriend out of an elevator by her hair. She wasn't listening to him. It was for the good. All those things was the same thing I was reading in Congress about why the Indians deserve to be pushed into Oklahoma. And this all said to me that there was something about today, now, that echoed other power struggles in the past. And what I wanted to get to was what created those power struggles, and how did we end up in a moment today that sounded so much like the Confederates had sounded, like the leading elite Confederates had sounded in the 1850s. And that, of course, reinforces to my mind what I decided was it has to do a lot with language. That what this book is about is how language creates power structures and creates societies that permit certain people to take power. But that, to me, one of the reasons I'm so excited about this is that, to me, speaks very much to what you did in Field of Blood, talking about the importance of emotion and how the coming of the Civil War, which you kind of focused more on the earlier part than I did, really had to do with emotion. So how did you end up writing that book?
Well, you're right that in a sense, although the book is about physical violence in the US Congress and the logic of it and the impact of it, what struck me, and when I began that book, was I knew it was going to be about Congress. I knew it was going to be about violence. I didn't know how much violence there was, but the language that people were throwing around and the response to the language, even just in the historical record, you could see how, in the case of my book, Southerners were really strategically and deliberately using language to intimidate or silence or manipulate people who disagreed with them in a way that worked. It worked really well. And in part, that's because it really relied on emotion, right? Intimidation is something that often works. Fear or humiliation are things that if you're in Congress and you're performing before a national audience, if you want to, you can manipulate that to really shape what someone is able to do. So kind of along the same lines of what you're talking about, what I was really interested in doing in my book was looking at the real dynamics of what was going on in Congress and how that was shaping politics overall.
You use the word bullying again and again and again. It's bullying behavior. And what I'm arguing is that the way bullying takes shape, at least not even just initially, the way bullying always takes shape is through language. The way you put things, the way you say things. We talk nowadays a lot about gaslighting, but really what you're doing is you're shaping a worldview through the use of language to establish dominance over somebody else, to bully them. And it is astonishing to me the parallels between the past, the 1850s, not all the past, because we don't always do it, but the 1850s and where we are right now.
Oh, no, for sure. And I think about that all the time, even just in the realm of bullying, because what bullying is about, and the reason why it's particularly effective in politics, is because you don't have to exert force. You have to make clear that you could exert force if you want to. It's about the threat, right? If you're a bully, you're suggesting you could do really ugly things if you wanted to, but you don't have to do them. You just have to be sure that the person being bullied understands that and will respond to that. It's a brilliant way to manipulate people, and when it works, it really works.
I need you to do me a favor, though.
Uh-oh.
The threat that I'll do that but I need you to do me a favor, though. I mean, exactly. A term we've heard. Yes, exactly.
It's like, I could do this to you.
Yes, or I could do something to you.
Right. Or we could get along.
Yeah. As long as you do what I want you to do.
Yeah. Now, what's an example in your book that you talk, one of the things that I think we both share in our books is this fascination with language and the power of language and the ways in which we take it for granted, but it's such a force of shaping politics. What is an instance in your book of a moment when it really struck you that language in and of itself was really having a shaping influence?
Well, there are two places it really shows up. I mean, it's kind of everywhere if you think about it. And I think one of the reasons more people don't study it is it's very hard to say this matters, because you can't quantify it. We all know it matters. Somebody said to me once, well, one of my earlier books, well, you never quantified how this talk was important. And I said, I understand I didn't do that, but can you stand there right now? This would have been in the 80s, I guess, or maybe the 90s. Can you stand there right now and tell me Rush Limbaugh doesn't matter? And he's like, well, of course he matters, but we can't measure it. I'm like, does that mean we shouldn't study it? You know? So the places that jumped out at me were in 1954. It cracks me up that you're the 1954 professor, because so much happened in 1954. In 1954, right after Joe McCarthy crashes and burns in the Army McCarthy hearings, because people once and for all actually see him. They don't just hear him. It's not just the language that gets prettied up. They actually see him. And rather than saying he's a crusader for anti-communism, they look at him and say, he's a thug. He's a bully, and we don't want to have any part of him. After that, shortly after that, William F. Buckley Jr. and his brother L. Brent Bazell come out with the book McCarthy and His Enemies. And in that, they say, well, McCarthy might have been a little rough around the edges, but he was right. We conservatives, this is what we consider the birth of movement conservative, and capitalized, because movement conservatism was not ever really traditional conservatism. It was a radical movement to undo the New Deal. And we're seeing it play out right now. So they write this book and they say, well, we conservatives have to stand against what they call liberalism. And by liberalism, they meant everybody else. They meant all the Democrats. They meant all the Eisenhower Republicans. This is in a time, 1954, when Eisenhower Republicanism looks terrific. We're getting the interstate highways. We've got the GI Bill putting everybody into middle-class jobs. Not everybody, of course. That's an exaggeration. It hit people of color, especially. It didn't do nearly as much for people of color. But a lot of people that I grew up with who would have been probably not even skilled workers, because of the GI Bill, vaulted into the middle class as engineers or as printers, or as any number of things that they couldn't do without an education, which was not attainable for them during the Depression. So in this moment, William F. Buckley Jr. and Bazell write this book, and they say, we conservatives are standing against all you liberals. So that's basically everybody else. And they do something really interesting in that book, because that's the time, for the first time, when they capitalize C conservative and capitalize liberal. And they're doing it, people just talk generally about we're all liberal. That's a literary critic says, you can't even talk about liberalism because everybody's a liberal these days. And they meant it in this general, we believe that the government has a role to play regulating business and providing a basic social safety net and promoting infrastructure like the interstate highways. We all agree with that. Just Republicans and Democrats have different ideas about which parts of that are more important. Well, so everybody kind of thought of themselves as liberal. They capitalize it. And they say, these guys are essentially like the Communist Party in China. They're a party, they're a cabal that are taking over America. And that powerful construction, and at the time it was the book itself was not terribly well received. People are like, really? McCarthy is a good guy? It doesn't get a lot of attention, but of course by now, the idea of being a liberal, remember in the 80s, people started to call it the L word. Yeah. And now it's like, literally, remember that? Don't call him the L word. And now it's sort of this epithet. And you could see that being constructed. So that was one moment. And the other moment was in the 1990s, Newt Gingrich's Political Action Committee, a PAC, literally, they were in charge of kind of, I don't want to use indoctrinating, but a word like that. They were kind of they were the coaches for the new Republicans, the newly elected Republicans, to kind of socialize them into the Republican Party. And what they do is they actually circulate a document with all the words that they should use when they talk about Democrats. And those are words like traitor and lazy and special interest and angry and all these really negative words. And then they had a list of what words they should use when they talked about Republicans and Republican policies. And they were patriots, fiscally responsible, family, happy, it's all this good stuff. And you could literally see the Republican Party under Newt Gingrich, which is the moment in which they write out of the party all the real Republicans, all the traditional Republicans that they then label rhinos, even though it's really the other way around. Newt Gingrich and the movement conservatives are Republicans in name only. Again, very powerful use of language. You could literally see them using language to divide the country in two and to label half of it as negative and half of it as positive. So it really, those were the two touchstones for me. But I'm trying to remember, you talked about a similar touchstone, I think, in Field of Blood, didn't you?
Well, certainly, I mean, what you're describing is what I talk about too. I mean, the scenario you just described with language is a small group of people creating a new we by creating a them.
Yeah. And
so it's fascinating because just capitalizing those words helps to suggest that there's an it there, right? That conservatism and liberalism are not just words, they're capitalized, so they're an it. And the power of that is, in a way, whoever's reading it doesn't even necessarily have an awareness of the power of that. They become an it just by looking at it. And that really gets back to the power of language and politics, because if you're really effective at that skill, then you're basically finding a way not just to create an us and a them, but to plug people into assumptions and emotions that are going to play well for you, right? Because words are like a direct drill, they can be, right into emotions, responses, right into things that you aren't necessarily going to process, right? And so one example, actually, in my first book, and it's
which is called Affairs of Honor, by the way. I loved it.
Oh, thank you. Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic. What's interesting, in part, is one of the factors of democracy and the vulnerabilities of democracy is how important language is, because democracy is about negotiating power, which is about persuasion. So by definition, it's more vulnerable and flexible, and that can be used for good and bad. But so all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, they're playing these kinds of games with words. And even in the first 10 years of the government, there's a Federalist, and the Federalist Party in the 1790s is, in a sense, more elitist and more big money driven, and are discomfited by democracy. And there's a letter from a Federalist who talks about, if you go out and give a speech in front of the public, and anyone uses the word aristocrat, you're done. Because that plugs into so many other things. That plugs into privilege and elitism and denial of rights. And there's a whole sort of cascade of things from that one word that 10 years earlier didn't have that baggage attached to it. So it's we're being, in a sense, we're responding to the same thing, which is the intense power that something like a word can have, and the ways in which that shapes power and politics.
Well, in the late 20th and early 21st century, the word was taxes. And another great moment where polls said people were not actually that concerned about taxes by the 1980s. But if you talked about taxes, it conjured up this idea that somehow the taxes of hardworking white people were going to go into the pockets of lazy people of color and feminists. And we even have a conversation by one of the political operatives, Lee Atwater, who talks about it. And he says, by 1968, you can't use racial epithets, although he uses the racial epithet in this quotation. He says you can't really go out and say, vote for me, or you're going to have to deal with this. He says, so we generalized it. We started talking about busing. So if you talk about busing, people knew what you were talking about. And he said, and then you could take one more step back and you start talking about taxes. And people are like, oh yeah, like I care about taxes. I know about this. And when you talk about taxes, it is not, you write it down on the paper or you study it in Congress. it is not carrying the baggage of, this long history of American fear of an underclass redistributing wealth. But the reality is, by 1980, when Americans hear Republican politicians swearing they will never raise taxes, and that Democrats want to take money from the makers and give it to the takers, it is absolutely coded racial language. So all you had to do and even now to some degree, all you have to do to make sure that we don't have social welfare legislation is to say, do you want your taxes raised? And there you go. That 150 years of American history is right on the table with that 3-letter word, and deploying it is the key to a certain kind of politics.
And it's so effective because it's so sneaky, right? And we see that all the time now. Someone will say something, and you'll see on social media, people will say, dog whistle, that's a dog whistle. And then other people will say, well, no, it's not. The person is just referring to X, Y, and Z. Well, it's probably a dog whistle. It probably is meant to have a coded message, but the fact that there can be an argument about that shows the power of that kind of attack.
And that also is a diversion, because you can say, that's not what I meant. I remember, I don't know about you, but I remember when people started using what we knew as the OK symbol as a white power symbol.
Right.
And I remember the first time I read that thinking, no, I've been doing that my whole life. And by the time you started seeing it in all these places, you're like, oh my God, you're right, that is a dog whistle. But it took, there's that period of ambiguity where if you said it was a white power symbol, especially older people looked at you and went, you people are social justice warriors. And it was actually a way to deploy that symbol in such a way that it was doubly powerful. Not only were you calling your people to you, but anybody who called you out on it then had uninvolved people saying, no, you're being paranoid, which again is one of the ways language works. It's why we keep talking these days so much about gaslighting. That's exactly how gaslighting works.
Right. And just as you're saying, in the early phase when there was that sort of weird ambiguity about, this means okay or does it mean something more? In that early period, if you step forward and says, oh no, it means something more, by some logic, to some people, you've declared your loyalty to the them.
Right.
So you've planted yourself somewhere just by asking a question, which is a fair question, but which buys right into the us and them creation that's shaping politics. And, it was striking to me when I was working on my book, the degree to which people at the time understood this kind of power. In the late 1850s, when we're moving up towards the Civil War, I found a lot of members of Congress, and actually others outside of Congress, saying to each other over and over again, we have to control our words, which is a striking thing to hear if you're talking about people in an intense sectional crisis and worried about if the Union is going to collapse, and they're saying, watch your words. That's like testimony to what a power and an emotional power they can have on a high level and on a popular level as well. There's one Southerner in that late period who refers to words being spoken in Congress as missiles. He says to a Northerner, don't send missiles at us. If certain kind of words, we're going to have bloodshed. So hold off on the missiles. So they're right plugged into this, but I think the power of that is it's so easy to not acknowledge it.
Well, and in the 19th century, they studied rhetoric. I mean, there were the people like Joshua Chamberlain from the famous in the 20th Maine was a professor of rhetoric. They literally studied how to use words to mobilize populations. And we kind of let that go in the early 20th century. And I've actually got on the back on these shelves a whole series of books on famous orations in history. So you could take from the 19th century, so you could take these home and study them. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we have permitted that to be the study of it to be forgotten, but then also for it to be deployed by people who are acting in such a way that most Americans are not aware of, that is really deeply problematic. I saw today there is a new ad out from the Trump campaign that is really, really misleading and chops all kinds of stuff up and does all kinds of stuff that is not historically accurate, and it makes people sound like they're saying things that they are not saying. Mm-hmm. I was going to give a great example from a book that you and I both know, where somebody used a quotation, and it was entirely accurate, except he took out the word not. which is, it just had, he's like, it's true. It's like, well, except for that little word not, which kind of mattered. But that brings up the question, one of the things that I really focus on is the difference between image and reality, and how people can tell if somebody is being manipulated or not. Because one of the things I lay out in How the South Won is, so once you get this us versus them, and my work is all based in this period, is largely theoretically based on Eric Hoffer, who wrote this book in 1951 called True Believers. And he was interested in how you take a body of people. In 1951, everybody's all worried about the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. And he says, and how they managed to rise. He says, who cares how they rose? Every generation has Hitlers and Mussolinis. What you care about is why in certain eras, some people will listen to them, because they're always there, but how do they rise at certain times? And what he argued was that once you've done the us and them thing we're talking about, and that is absolutely done by language, then you have to kind of weaponize it. And so I went from that and came up with, in the 1850s, these 4 stages of how you go from it's in my interest to create an us and them, to how that turns into first a societal view of, well, yeah, we have an us and them, and this us's is better than the others through religion, through society, through all those things. And then those thems, well, they probably shouldn't vote. And once they can't vote, they really shouldn't have any power. And pretty soon you're at a point where if the people who are defined as the others are still trying to have a say in society, you actually start killing them. I mean, and that's a leap that they didn't, that obviously that you don't always get to, but it's a 4-stage process. And that question of how do you know when you're being manipulated? And how do you stop the process, I think, is one that speaks directly to this moment. And I wonder, I know you have ideas about that, and I think that's probably an important place to go. How do people know that they're being manipulated?
I mean, it's a really good question. It's probably the most consistent question that my students ask me when we're studying political history, right? And in my classes, I'm mostly looking at the late 18th and early 19th century. So we're even looking at, founders who are supposedly, great men who say reliable things. But inevitably, if you're talking about politics and then you're talking about words, the students get to a point where they get confused and they basically say outright what you just said, which is, how do I know what to believe? Right? How do I know, when do these people mean what they're saying, and when are they saying things just to have an impact? So how can I judge when they're being politicians or when they're being sincere? Now, the fact that you have to ask that question tells you a lot about politics, right? Because it's that fuzziness that is the engine of it, so to speak. But in part, my answer to that question always has to do with being aware of details, surroundings, contexts, not letting yourself respond in the way that often you're expected to respond, which is emotionally. If someone says something and you get swept up and you have a response, but rather, if you are able to step back and think about who's speaking, who do they think they're speaking to, what outcomes might they want or not want, to really focus on the details, which in a sense is what I teach as a historian teaching history majors, right? It's all about thinking about evidence, being able to think about evidence, what it is, what it means, and what the circumstances are that might shape its meaning. So, I mean, it's a tricky question. I can't say that I sit here now all the time and hear someone say something and think to myself, well, that's totally, he really believes that. Sometimes you can tell and sometimes you can't, but you have to think about it before assuming something. And I think particularly now, when technology, technology always shapes democracy in unpredictable ways. And right now, one of the things it's doing is making it even harder than normal to decide what facts are. So even as I'm sitting here saying you need to step back and consider circumstances, sometimes it's hard nowadays to even know what the circumstances are. It's confusing. I mean, I guess I would say, since your book stretches over time, right, that the confusion of truth and reality is ultimately part of what creates a particular kind of moment in politics.
So I say, I tell my students kind of, certainly we always do the who, what, why, when, where, and all that, but I always talk about 2 things. And one is step back for a second. Like, do you really think that your neighbors are, keeping babies in the basement? Step back for a second. Do you really think that this would have happened? Because so much of what we hear is and we see this in the 1850s, of course, but certainly in the present moment, so much what you hear, you're like, oh my God, they're going to do. And then you think, really? Like I know a lot of the people like that. And, I've met a lot of people in my life. And to my knowledge, none of them ever,
Right.
people in barrels in the basement, that's kind of not normal behavior. So that's the first stage. But the other thing I always talk about, and it's actually funny that I'm telling you that because of this pandemic, I am actually sitting on property that belonged once upon a time to the woman who told me this. She's long gone. She was born in 1896, although if anybody checked her, you would see that she lied about her age. And she was, when I was young and very into ideology, I care a lot about how people think about stuff. And I'd come to her house and I would say, oh, well, the Republicans, because that's who I was studying, the Republicans believe this and they did this. And then she'd say, Heather, who was getting the money and who was giving the money? And I was like, no, they cared about this. She's like, Heather, who was getting the money? And she would always say, follow the money, Heather, follow the money. And that's the other thing that we see all the time is people will send stuff to you and say, is this real? Is this real? This is terrifying. Is this real? And it's like, think about who's making the money from this.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see this, speaking of us versus them, I get this all the time. I don't know about you, I get emails saying, you only say the things you do because, you're so highly paid. It's like, seriously? Like I'm no complaints. I make a very good living. But the idea that somehow Sean Hannity is telling the truth to them and I am not because I'm so well paid, it's like, how much he's worth is on the internet. I promise you, as a college professor, I am not giving Sean Hannity a run for his money, So you might want to sit there and say, plus I still do my day job. You might want to sit there and say, who's making money from this particular video and who's going to stand to gain not only from the propaganda, but also from the legislation that's being put in place. I could sit here and tell you that I'm doing fabulous things for the farmers in Iowa, but you might want to look at what I'm doing and not what I'm saying, because what I'm saying, I can say anything. I can tell you it's snowing outside. That doesn't make it snowing outside. And that's one of the really important things I think that both the 1850s and the present bring to the table is, if you're not going to be swept up in this emotional language, how do you step out of it? And that's I think both of those eras talk about really examining who's talking and why, what emotions it's triggering in you. Does it make you feel angry and afraid and miserable? Or does it make you feel, hey, I can do something, I'm empowered? That's a really important distinction too. And also, is it believable? Is there really going to be Sharia law in Oklahoma? I was a waitress in Oklahoma. I don't think I ever heard anybody even talk about Sharia law. So, and I don't think I ever saw anybody who would have brought Sharia law. So, that was one of those ones that made the rounds, and you thought, really? Sharia law in Oklahoma? Like, if it happened, I'd go see it.
Right. Right. And so often it's, in one way or another, a way to plug into the reality is to ask that kind of question, right? Is to ask, well, just recently someone on Twitter was proclaiming about all exes, right? All people who are like this are all like that. They're evil and they're out for no good and they're only out for money and blah, blah, blah. And my response was, so am I evil?
Yeah.
I mean, if everyone's like that, do you really, like, we engage all the time. Am I? No, well, you're not. Oh, okay. So who are you talking about? Like, who fits into that? And why are you saying that? So, but what's interesting about what you just said is, on the one hand, it's a way to decode and process something, but you can also see how it might feed into conspiracy theories, right? And that's one of the big sort of detracting problems of this kind of moment that we're in now, that the 1850s were, that actually the late 1790s were, when there's a real us and them component and people really feel that something fundamentally American is going to be decided. They want to understand how and why things are working the way they do, and they're almost more prone
Yes.
to come up with a conspiracy to explain it.
Yeah, and I've never quite understood that because, you know, I am not a conspiracy person. I'm a very kind of, let's just keep asking questions till we get to the base of things. And one of the things that's always astonished me is if you want to understand conspiracies and you want to understand how things really work, they're everywhere around you. Like if you want to really get into something, go ahead and look at the history of the post office, which is this entangled, complicated, fascinating human story. Why are you manufacturing something when there's so much real stuff right here that is so fascinating? And I was talking just yesterday about the lead up to the Iraq War. And the group of neocons who organized for the Project for the American Century. And I remember hearing about that in the 1990s and thinking, oh, that's tinfoil hat stuff. It's on the internet, signed by them, you know, by Bill Kristol and Donald Rumsfeld and all the people who went on to get us involved in war in Iraq. And I thought, why on earth are people inventing conspiracy theories about what happened when you literally can sit there and say, here's a group of people who launched this argument that after the Cold War, America needed to reassert its world power, and it needed to do so beginning in Iraq. And then I'd also heard about Donald Rumsfeld after 9/11 saying, did we get enough to hit Saddam Hussein? And me thinking, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. He couldn't possibly have said that. And then, of course, once I did the research, he did. He absolutely said it. It's everywhere. It was never contested. It's everywhere when you look. So I always wonder about conspiracy theorists because, like, if you want to get really involved in stuff and look at the levers of power and look at how things change, it's all right there. You don't have to invent something happening in a basement of a pizza parlor, or the idea that somehow, you know, somebody planted a birth certificate in Hawaii, or that Anthony Fauci is somehow, you know, started something back with AIDS that has now been uncovered by a failed medical researcher. There's plenty that's right there that you can actually get into. I think there's actually an element of it that goes beyond simply wanting to feel like you know something nobody else does. I think it's also partly a sign of people feeling unempowered. They want to say that they know more than the experts, that somehow the experts are cheating and they somehow know more just by their own gut sense. And that's really deeply problematic because, as I said to somebody yesterday, you know, experts can be really prickly. We tend to be, I think you and I are fairly approachable, but certainly I anyway, and I'm sure you have had experiences asking what seemed like a pretty simple question to an expert, and they treated you like you were the stupidest, dumbest, like you weren't even really sentient life. And it's just always mortifying, no matter how it happens. So some of them can be difficult, but I don't think I've ever met a real expert who wasn't deeply and profoundly in love with their topic and in love with the truth. So you don't have to be their friend, but the idea that somehow some researcher, some real researcher who is with luck pulling down $30,000, $40,000 a year tops is working 80-hour weeks because somehow she's on the payroll of big pharma is just nuts. You know, if you want to look at who's on the payroll of big pharma, you can actually see that. Right. But the idea that somehow this poor researcher at, you know, University of Nebraska is part of some conspiracy is just, again, a real divorce from reality.
Right. It's a satisfying divorce from reality, right? Because it's plugging right into what you're assuming, so it validates your assumptions, it plugs right into your emotions, it creates a neat story. Right? Very often conspiracies create a very clear story, and just as you're saying, you have to find the facts, you have to figure them out, you have to understand how they fit together or don't fit together, which is sometimes not that difficult to do, but it's not as satisfying. And also, you know, the people who you talk about, including us, you know, who are experts in their topic and passionate about it and want to talk to people about it and want to engage about it, what they are dealing with as experts is something that conspiracy theories don't plug into. And that is, history isn't about clear stories. It's the struggles that create what's happening, right? And the struggles are always more interesting than the storylines that we create because they're neat and tidy and wrap things up in a bow. The struggle and the fight and the complexity and the ambiguities that's part of the fascinating part about history, is finding them and immersing yourself in them and trying to look through the eyes of someone at that time to see how they're making sense of that. I mean, that's some of what I love to do about history is, I did it when I studied dueling, right? How does that make sense? Two guys are mad at each other and they go to a field and one shoots at the other and then everything is solved. Really? Okay. Hundreds of people thought that was logical. So, okay, let me dig around and figure out the logic of it, because it's really logical because they're risking their lives for that logic. So let me figure out, and of course it's mixed up with things like reputation and political power, and all of these things get mixed in and makes perfect sense. But it's far more interesting than, boy, they were mean and nasty in those periods and they hated each other, those people, so they killed each other, and what a rough time that was. That doesn't tell you really about the time period or about
and this also fascinates me because one of the things we do in history is, people say either everything in the past was great or everything in the past was bad. Human beings are mixed, and I think our history is mixed. And one of the things about the polarizing language we're talking about, and I want to emphasize polarizing language that is designed to create and sustain a power structure. One of the problems with that very clear narrative language is it takes away the ambiguity of what human beings really are. And while that's got a negative side to it, one of the things that always just that I find so powerful about American history is that your heroes come from nowhere. I mean, they really, like, nobody wakes, as I always say to my students, nobody wakes up one morning and says, I'm going to be a real jerk today. I'm going to go out and kill a bunch of people. Yeah. They put their feet on the floor and they say, I'm going to go out and protect my family. They don't see themselves, nobody ever sees themselves as a villain. They're unless they are, I guess there's always a caveat, but for the most part, regular people, the kind of regular people you talk about in Field of Blood, who, like your French guy who goes into Washington and he's just a regular nice guy. And by the end of the book, he's carrying a gun. He didn't wake up and say, I'm going to be a warrior today. He woke up and said, I'm going to go about my day. And gradually he got radicalized. And one of the things that fascinates me about that is the opposite is also true. People put their feet on the ground and they don't say, I'm going to go out and be a hero today. They go out and they say, I'm going to go fishing today because I gotta put food on the table. Or, as you and I know so well, I'm gonna go to work today because it's my job to go to work. Or my favorite, there's a great book by Teresa Kaminsky called Angels of the Underground that I really love because it's about the 4 women during World War II who ran the underground in the Philippines. And you read them in their sort of obit life and they're like, oh, she did this and she did that and she did that. And I hate to give away a spoiler here, but one of them becomes a hero because she goes to get enrolled by the Japanese, which is going to lead to everybody else to be in camp and, incarcerated. They say that's not going to happen, but it is. But she like everybody else, she goes to be signed up. And where they're supposed to be signed up, just before the Japanese are coming to do that, she has a panic attack. And she can't be there. And her friends are like, no, just stay the 10 minutes, write your name, and then you can go home. And she's like, no, I can't, I got to go home. So because she has a panic attack, she gets put in such a position that she is the only person who has not been rounded up. And she's terrified. So she's in an apartment for weeks without being discovered. So she watches the movements of the occupiers the whole time. And when she emerges, she has information that nobody else does. But she did not wake up the morning of enrollment and say, I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to refuse to be enrolled. I'm going to spy on the Japanese. She went, yeah, I'm going to go along with everybody else. I'll go down, get enrolled, come home, go to have dinner and go to bed. But she had a panic attack. So when people are like, where are our heroes? I'm like, they're us. You might be putting your feet on the ground today thinking that you're just going to, go downtown. And when the push comes to shove and you have to make a decision between doing what's right and doing what's wrong, if you choose what's right, that's the first step to being a hero. And that's the piece that I feel like kind of has gotten lost in these sweeping narratives where, you're either good or you're bad. No, you're both. The trick is to keep choosing to be good.
Right. Well, right. That's when you look over the broad sweep of American history, There is a tendency often among some people to try and find the golden period, right? The good period, the period when it was all good and smiley and happy, and then it got bad after that point. And of course, there is no golden moment.
It was August 13th, 1897.
For 10 minutes in the morning.
That's right, exactly.
But that moment doesn't exist, right? That there are always compromises being made. There are always people making good choices and bad choices. And the struggle of any country, but certainly the American story, is about some people having ideals and ambitions and hoping to make the right choice, other people being motivated by different things, some people unable to perceive possibilities, other people able to, and these things bang up against each other and choices are made and the story moves on. There is no moment in American history when you don't have the struggle and the ugliness and the ideals all bound up together in one big messy blob. And part of the challenge of being a historian is acknowledging that, allowing yourself to believe in the things that feel believable without painting something as perfect or golden or better. When you do that, you erase the human struggle from history, and that is what history is.
It's also what the future is. People making choices about where we go from here.
Right.
And how we move past the moment that we're currently in.
Right. Now I'm glancing at the corner of my screen. I see that a lot of people have been asking a question in a general kind of a way, which is, and of course this makes sense because we keep talking about history and the links to the present. They're asking in one way or another how the Civil War itself laid foundations for rhetorical shifts and ideological shifts that we see today. So let's begin there. How do we see, and particularly this applies to your book.
You have a book, that's right.
This conversation is so good. In your book, since you're making that pattern clear over time, how does the first period in your book lay patterns for what comes later and in particular comes today? Or does it?
Okay, so this is a great question, and I will be as brief as I can, but I do think it's a fascinating pattern. And what I would point to is less the Civil War than it is Reconstruction. What happens in the Civil War, I argue, but I also believe, is that there are two really important things that come out of the Civil War years under what is then the Republican Party, the brand new Republican Party. And that is, on the one hand, you get a push for the inclusion of African American men in the Declaration of Independence, in the idea that they too should have equality of opportunity. Not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And you get that push, obviously, during the Civil War. You also get that during the Civil War with the Republican Party, you get a rejection of the idea that a few wealthy men should run the country. You get the idea that the government itself should be the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that plays out in ways that we tend to forget today. It plays out, obviously, in the inclusion of African American men in that definition of body politic, but it's the Homestead Act, which offers free land. It's actually, of course, American Indian land, but the land to farmers to grow crops and to make money and to be upwardly mobile. We get the establishment of our public universities. We get the establishment of the Department of Agriculture, which is designed to get really good seeds into the hand of regular farmers. We get the Union Pacific Railroad Act, and the Northern Pacific, which is designed to actually get people out to the Western Plains and to the Western mines so that they can join this upwardly mobile society. We get our first national money so that people can do business over state lines, which, by the way, Joanne has a great piece on in Field of Blood, when your guy is trying to get across the country and his money doesn't work. Right. That's the best write-up I've ever seen of that. And you also get for the first time in American history, national taxes, national taxation. So you get the idea that people are investing in the government, and that government in turn is doing something for the people. The people own the government. The government then takes care of the people who are investing in it, and that's everybody. It's not just people buying bonds. It's anybody paying what is essentially a sales tax, and it's income taxes. Those are both invented during the Civil War by the Republican Party. So what happens after the war is these things all kind of cluster together. And during Reconstruction, in the summer of 1866, what happens is that Southern Democrats who loathe the idea of Black participation in society, mind you, they don't want slavery back. Slavery has completely disintegrated during the war, and it's really not, they might want it back, but it's clear that it's long gone, that you could never really untangle everything that happened during the Civil War. So, but they don't want Black rights. And what happens is during the summer of 65, as African Americans try to enter the Free Labor Society and work for their survival, they get cheated. Their former employers cheat them, they rape the women, they attack the men, they kill some of the men. And because of the Black codes that the Southern constitutional conventions write in the summer of 65, they can't testify in court. They can't sue. They have no rights at all. So under those circumstances, African Americans go to Army officers who are empowered under a department that's been established in the Army called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. They go to them and they say, help us out here. Like, we worked hard, and they just, after 3 months of work, they say we didn't earn anything. And the Freedmen's Bureau officers, who are Army officers, because that's the area of the government that the Congress chose to put it in, the officers of the, speaking of language, of the Bureau of Refugees, white, Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, it's the summer of 65, it becomes known as the Freedmen's Bureau. They decide in favor of African Americans about 70% of the time, about 68% of the time. And it's that point that Southern Democrats start to say, we didn't care about slavery after all. What we really care about is this giant federal government that's telling us how to treat our people. Well, this is going to change over the next 3 to 4 years as Republicans in Congress try to guarantee that African American men have the ability to protect their own rights through new civil rights legislation and by establishing federal courts where they can testify under the Freedmen's Bureau. Andrew Johnson steps in and he says, no, you can't do that, because what you're doing is you're first of all, giving African American men rights that no other American man has, because white American men are not labeled by name in any legislation because it was all written for them. But he says, you're giving rights to Black men that you're not giving to white men. But then he says something huge, and he says, what you are doing is you're creating this giant federal government that is designed to give rights to Black people that white people, he's using the word men, that white men don't have. And the only way to pay for those rights is by tax levies, through tax dollars. So what you are doing is you are redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to lazy, impoverished African Americans. That language right there is in his vetoes of 2 bills in 1866. And by 1871, Southern Democrats who want to get rid of Black rights based on racial issues suddenly say, oh, it wasn't race we were worried about. It's the fact you're having poor people, these people who used to hoe the fields, are now suddenly saying how our tax dollars are supposed to be spent. And it's right there we get the use of the word socialism. All the papers talk all the time about socialism in the South, about how socialism has taken over America because state legislatures and the federal government are creating bureaus and programs that have to be paid for by tax levies, and those things will benefit African Americans. And because African Americans are impoverished after the war, that's going to come from taxes on white people. And even today, you hear people screaming constantly on the Massachusetts, in front of the Massachusetts State House 2 days ago. There was somebody saying that the whole idea of closing down society so we didn't have to die from a pandemic was because Democrats want to turn it into the socialist states of America. And what they're saying is that any legislation that helps achieve equality of opportunity across society is a redistribution of wealth because it's going to take tax dollars. It has nothing to do with 20th century socialism and the ownership of the state ownership of production. It is just here, right here from this era of Reconstruction, and it comes right out of the Civil War. And we have been, I keep saying, I have various articles about when Reconstruction ended, but you could make a really good case for the fact Reconstruction still hasn't ended because we're having the exact same conversation today that they had in the 1870s.
So a civil war, by definition, shuffles the relationship between government and the people, and in doing so, scrambles the we. And in
That's right.
what you're describing here is an ongoing battle for who the we is, who's included in it, who's excluded from it. And those are obviously highly significant questions that, we're smacked. At some periods, they're more pressing and immediate than they are in others. We're in one right now. When people know that that's part of the battle that's going on here, and that's part of why it's so personal. People are so engaged in that kind of a way.
Well, it's so cool because this is exactly what happened after World War II. It was really clear who the we was. It was the GIs. It was the GIs from all walks of life, from the Mexican Americans, who were some of the first to say, hey, wait a minute, we should have the vote here under Dr. Garcia, and African Americans, of course, and women. My mother was a WAC. There was this, it's our government. We just literally saved democracy. It's our government. And somehow that has by the use of language, we've gotten to this moment where the we is a very small group of people who believe that they should control the wealth and the power in society for the good of the rest of us. And that to me sounds very much like what the slaveholders were saying, and I'm not comfortable with that.
Right, precisely. Now I'm going to switch a little bit because we were asked a question which talks, in a sense, more about us and historians than it does about periods, and I think it's an important point to talk about. So the question is, basically, given what we are doing right here in speaking to each other and speaking with this great group of people in the public, why are historians at the current moment so eager to be, quote unquote, public intellectuals? What is it at this current moment that is inspiring some historians to step more aggressively forward to the public than moments where they might have done that in the past?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that because it has not been my experience that there are many people, certainly of our generation, doing it. There's the Twitter storians, and we're all, but literally you could count us on a maximum of two hands. I think younger historians have always been involved in the public sphere because there really aren't any jobs in the academy. Mm-hmm. But I'd actually be here, sound like Eric Hoffer here. Joanne and I have both been public intellectuals for most of our careers. It's just that nobody paid any attention. but no, literally, the letters from an American, I did not wake up I didn't wake up one day and put my feet on the ground and say, I'm going to write these letters. I was painting my house and I got stung by a yellow jacket and I'm allergic to them. So I had to observe, and I didn't have my EpiPen, so I had to observe the reaction. And I just started writing about politics. And the next thing I knew, everybody was asking questions. And so that was born. And it was very funny to me at one point, I wrote an article. I didn't have time to write articles for newspapers any longer, but I wrote an article in a place in The Guardian, where I love to write, and I've written for many years. Someone said, oh my God, it's great, they discovered you. I'm like, it's actually the other way around. But I think it's just that we're in a moment where we recognize that we have for too long paid attention to a narrative that was not rooted in reality. And what historians have is, and many of our children and family members would probably say have too much of, it is reality. It's saying, now, wait a minute, that's not what happened in 1954, or that's not who Grover Cleveland was. And I think people love to actually hear our real story. How did we get here, and how can we get out of it?
Right. And I think that's a thing that historians bring to that kind of conversation that other kinds of commentators don't necessarily. And it's, I often joke that I have a double brain at this particular moment. So part of my brain is looking at what's happening and thinking broad patterns, right?
Yes.
And thinking about the past and thinking about what has happened and thinking about why it happened and, being a historian. So some part of me is making machinations. The other part of me is basically going, ah! And so I have a sense of urgency, and I'm thinking like a historian. I do think there's a different sense of urgency to this moment. And you're right, both of us have been engaged in talking to the public forever, but there's an urgency to this moment that is different, or feels different to me, so that, Thursday mornings I do an online kind of webinar where I talk about looking at the past, and then I talk about how you can use those tools to figure out the present. That was born because I was driving myself crazy trying to think of something I could write or do that would get people to ask smart questions about the present. And that was the only thing I could think of. It's like, I'm a historian, I can talk about history and then show how it relates to the present. Hey, and I can do it on my computer with a webinar because lo and behold, this moment has taught us things about positives about technology. But so I do think the moment has added urgency to the equation of things that helps structure how historians think generally, and then how more public-minded historians think, or at least in my case.
I also think it's really come to the fore for me lately, how shallow so much reporting is. And of course, reporters are doing something different than you and I are, but I always find it enormously frustrating when you get an article and it says, and I'm making this up, Joe Smith, director of the office of something you've never heard of, wrote a document that pertains to something you've never heard of. And, some congressperson, some important congressperson said, I'm going to cut his mother off at the knees. And you're like, what on earth just happened here? And so a lot of what I do is literally saying, here are the players. Here's the larger story of why this play matters, and here's how it might come out. And people complain sometimes that I don't go into a lot of stuff. And it's like, if you actually literally took the column, the posts I write, and you took out my explanations of who each person is, I bet there's probably 50 to 200 words in every one of those posts that is just who the players are. And then if you went and took out who the play, what the play is, the actual analysis comes down to being probably less than half of what I write every night. But at least, so there's this big thing, this whistleblower thing now with the guy, with Rick Bright. The first time I saw that last night, I'm like, I remember this, I remember that name, I remember there was a whistleblower complaint, and I remember that he was somebody important. But, so many of the articles just sort of said, oh, and he did this, and it's like, wait a minute, there was a backstory. I know there was a backstory. I wrote about the backstory. And I think that's a lot of why we're important, is because right now is because we can say, here's the context, and here's why it matters. And really, there's not room in most newspapers to do that. Washington Post is doing it very well, but their articles are too long because they do it for every single story. And you're like, I've got a job, I can't really read
100,000 stories every day, right?
And they do a great job with it, but really, I can't, and nobody can read that much stuff on each particular thing.
And history, the study of history is about context.
Yes.
So, we're primed to do that sort of thing right at this moment.
And we have the stories. So it's not just, people are sending me wonderful, wonderful stuff about mathematical models. And they're really, really interesting. But it's hard to make a mathematical model come alive.
Right.
And we've got the stories to make it come alive.
Well, right. We've got, in a sense, the humanity. And, that what can touch you more at a moment of change that feels unsettling than people who can connect with the humanity of the past and the humanity of the present and try and make sense of it in a way that's sincere and comes from your own attempt to figure it out. So that all of that stuff makes perfect sense to me. I'm going to flip things. This is a really good question, and it's a turning things on its head kind of question, which I think we should address. So we've talked about, and in particular, you've talked about conservatives, capital C conservatives, doing things with language to shape capital L, what people think of capital L liberals. So is there some kind of liberal counter language? Is this happening on both sides? And if it is, are there similarities, differences? How is the reverse working?
Okay, so this is obviously a huge question, but it's a fabulous question. And there's a whole book to be written here that is out there. This is a great question, because I think Joanne said something earlier that is really important, and that's that and this is absolutely what the new book is about, that one of the things that has really been powerful since in America, really, especially since the 1980s, is the degree to which the movement conservative language has dominated everything. So that even the Democrats got swept up, the new Democrats got swept up into the idea of, of market forces controlling things. And we ended up with a nation that was in such a place that that it really was shaped along a certain kind of ideological view. So even if you were speaking up against that, even if you were saying, no, there aren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even if you were doing those things, you were still reinforcing the space that rhetoric had caused. And one of the big projects that I'm engaged in, and that people always say to me, what can I do? One of the things that I'm really engaged in, and really from my study of history, is to develop a different language, to say, yeah, we're an us versus them. And my us includes people who want equality of opportunity, people who want to use the government not to put money at the top, but to put money at the bottom, and to make sure it rises. Make sure people can work a job and actually make enough money to support a family. That's my us, and my us looks very much like the us of the 1950s, of the Eisenhower years, except I would hope that my us is a great deal more inclusive. I think you could get into a big argument about what Eisenhower was really up to, but there's no doubt that the 1950s were not exactly a ducky time for people of color or women or whomever. But if I am right that language controls politics and power, and if Joanne is right that it controls it by tapping into deeper human emotions and American values, the way that you change history is by changing our language. And to be able to, when you use the word patriot, and you don't mean somebody screaming in someone's face at a state house, but you mean the guy who, gets in his truck and goes off to work to support his family, that change of association of words and the change in our national narrative is what changes history. And that's why I always say to people, speak up, say what you believe in, say what things matter, because that's what is going to change history and change the moment we're in. It's making people feel good about being an American and not feeling like it means hating and killing and destroying and dominating, but rather building up and working together and creating a society where everybody has equality of opportunity. So is there another narrative? There has not been really since FDR, and I would argue that his was very important, of course, but it's not really the one for today, because it too was really male-centered, heteronormative, and really really racist and sexist. But we have the space to build our own new narrative. And this is, to me, the great excitement of this moment. We're in a crisis, and we get to decide what comes next. We get to put our feet on the floor in the morning and say, I'm going to make the next right choice. And while it sucks, I'd certainly rather be sitting on a hammock reading a book. It's a really exciting time. It's a really exciting time to get to choose the future.
And it's also a moment when we are being called upon to think about processes, right? To appreciate processes of government, to appreciate how the Constitution on a basic level structures. What does it mean to have separate branches of government? What is it? What are checks and balances? What are the different things that being a citizen has meant over time? How does our politics work? What is the process itself? I think some of what we're experiencing right now is people who aren't plugged into that. And as a historian, some of what I'm experiencing is the need to step forward and say, no, like the process matters, the how matters. If you can't, for example, trust elections, just the simple process, which isn't to say they'll always be 100% honest or, will happen smoothly, but basically, if generally Americans can't step back and say, we believe in the process of elections, we believe in oversight, we believe if it goes wrong, there's a way to fix it. Well, then what process comes in its place, right? This is, we've talked about this before, but when I talk about the founding, and it's very tempting when you talk about the founding to talk about, capital I, ideology, and, great thoughts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one conversation. But if you ask them at the time what their most valuable contribution was, some of them even said so outright. They would tell you the process that they created, right? Madison says that, Jefferson says that there are going to be all kinds of crises. We can't even imagine what they're going to be in the future, but we're setting in motion a process here with the Constitution, actually with the convention itself, which is people in a room debating, not always debating in a way that we wish. There are things we might have hoped they had done differently, but still. We're putting a process in motion that during times of crisis, you can at least refer back to that and have a platform so that you can find a way out that is part of a shared agreement on how this nation works. And I feel like we've sort of lost the process, and we're so used to things being unprecedented, I suppose, in many ways right now, that we're losing that touchstone, and it's a really important one.
Well, and that's exactly what happened in the 1850s, and now in the past 3 years, that we are destroying the process. And once you've destroyed the process, the pieces are there for anyone to pick up. And this was the ultimate outcome in the 1850s, of course, was that when the people who didn't like the process didn't get their way in it, they simply said, we're done. We're taking our marbles and going home. And as we're watching the process being destroyed around us today, what is the outcome of that? And I talk about this all the time. If you don't have that group of bureaucrats, the people who are loyal to the government or to the state, not to an individual, then you become a group of, at best, of oligarchs. You are beholden to whomever holds the reins of power, and you have no means of reclaiming that, because at the very least, even if you replace that person with your person, you still don't have a disinterested process in place. And that's the other thing we desperately need to do, is protect elections, but also protect nonpartisan civil servants, the ones who are terrific at what they do and loyal to the state.
They're dedicated to the state and the process. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think on that note, we've sort of pulled ourselves around to pathways that certainly lead to progress. I think along the lines of what you're saying, it's tempting to experience this moment and think either everything's going to be fine or we're done. And I think part of the spirit of what you're saying is we still matter as the public. This is a moment of extreme contingency. So what we do matters. So it's a moment of possibility. It's a moment of contingency. And that's a positive and encouraging message to pull out of this moment.
Amen. And that's the way to look at it. But it's also the moment to realize that democracy is not a spectator sport. And this has been so exciting to see so many people get involved in the process that you and I have loved in our own private ways for many decades. It's also a moment to recognize really that democracy is about us, and we need to step up to the plate and decide what we want to do with it, what we're okay with and what we're not okay with. Okay. So for all the terror of this moment, it is also one of extraordinary possibility.
Absolutely. And I think maybe it makes sense to end there. I want to thank everyone out there who has been watching and engaging in this conversation for coming. Obviously, look towards Brooklyn Historical Society for more programs now that we're in the virtual universe. Who knows what will happen in this virtual. But at any rate, thank you all for coming. I've had great fun today.
And thank you, Joanne. This has been great, and I hope we do many of these in the future. And thanks to the Brooklyn Historical Society, and thank you for everybody to come and have patience with what was not probably what you expected, but seemed to me to be a much more fun thing to do. If you want to follow along with the actual book, I do my own Facebook series on it. I'm on the 6th week, and that will be archived on YouTube as soon as I get the time to label the videos. So, if you felt like you didn't get enough here on that particular thing, it is available elsewhere as well. So thank you very much, Joanne. It was totally fun.
I'll actually even add my last little commercial advertisement along the lines of yours. Those of you who are interested in my conversations about looking at history and applying it to the present, it's every Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, and they are live at and then archived at nche.net/conversations.
I can't believe you remembered that.
I can't.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.